If you want to see how quickly a $60 million tech empire can crumble, you only need to watch an ambitious CEO hand the keys of the kingdom to his spoiled child. My name is Emma Larson. At 42 years old, I had spent nearly a decade of my life building the foundational architecture of Aegis financial systems. I knew every single line of code in our network. My crowning achievement was a system called OmniCore. OmniCore was a proprietary $60 million transaction engine. To put it simply, it was the digital heart of our company. It processed billions of dollars every single day for elite global enterprises and major banking clients. If OmniCore ran smoothly, the company made millions. If it blinked for even a second, the financial world noticed. I had sacrificed weekends, holidays, and late nights to make sure it never blinked. But on a freezing Tuesday morning, my entire life's work was upended inside the executive boardroom. Our CEO, Jackson Sterling, called an emergency all-hands meeting at exactly 9 in the morning. The room was packed with senior engineers, developers, and project managers. Jackson stood at the head of the long mahogany table, wearing a smug smile. Next to him stood a 23-year-old kid in an expensive, unwrinkled designer suit. This was Lucas Sterling, the CEO's son. Lucas was a fresh university graduate with a basic marketing degree, absolutely zero technical skills, and an attitude that screamed unearned privilege. Jackson cleared his throat and made the announcement that sent a shockwave through the room. He told us that Lucas was being promoted to Senior Vice President of Engineering. This meant that a kid who barely knew how to restart a computer was now my direct boss. Lucas didn't waste a single second showing us his unearned arrogance. He leaned against the boardroom table, smirked at the room, and looked directly at me. He told me that his first order of business was to audit the workflow. He demanded that I immediately hand over the master root administrative credentials to OmniCore's core code repository. I felt a cold chill run down my spine. I kept my voice entirely calm and professional as I explained the reality of the situation. I told him that OmniCore operated under strict security protocols. I explained that accessing the live production environment without staging clearance was incredibly dangerous. We had a strict rule that no one, not even the head architect, touched the live core without an intensive peer review process. Lucas' face flushed red with anger. He scoffed and asked me if I was refusing to follow a direct order from my superior. Before I could even answer, Jackson cut me off completely. The CEO slammed his hand on the table and looked at me with pure ice in his eyes. He told me that he would not tolerate insubordination on his son's very first day. He looked me dead in the eye and said that if I did not transfer the master root access codes to Lucas within the next 5 minutes, he would terminate my employment on the spot for cause. I looked around the room. The other engineers looked down at their laps, too terrified of losing their jobs to speak up. I realized right then that logic and safety meant nothing to these two men. Power and ego were all that mattered. Forced to comply, I opened my laptop, typed out the administrative credentials, and transferred the root access codes directly to Lucas's profile. By 11:45 a.m., Lucas decided he wanted to prove his authority to the entire engineering team. He wanted to show everyone who was in charge. He logged into the live system and declared that he was going to clean up what he called our messy back-end file structures. He didn't read my explicit operational documentation. He completely ignored every single automated red warning prompt that flashed on his screen. Worst of all, he bypassed the development sandbox entirely, the safe testing environment where we test changes without affecting the real world. Instead, Lucas executed a global, unreplicated hard delete command directly on the primary production database. At exactly noon, the office emergency alarms began to blare. My monitors started flashing red, and then, one by one, they went completely pitch black. The entire $60 million codebase was completely erased from existence. I sat perfectly still at my desk, watching the chaos unfold, frozen in a state of cold, calculated stillness. As the loud emergency sirens echoed through the tech floor, the entire office erupted into pure panic. Red warning lights spun across the ceiling. Senior developers were shouting, running from desk to desk, desperately trying to figure out why our entire network had suddenly collapsed. In the center of the room sat Lucas. He was sweating profusely, frantically slapping random keys on his keyboard, and screaming at the top of his lungs that our proprietary software was experiencing some kind of random glitch. Within 3 minutes, Jackson came sprinting out of the executive elevator and burst into the command center. He demanded to know why our system was failing and why the clients were already calling. Instead of taking ownership of his catastrophic mistake, Lucas stood up, pointed a trembling, sweating finger directly at me, and lied. He loudly claimed that I had intentionally engineered a faulty, fragile architecture just to sabotage his very first day on the job. He told his father that I had set him up to fail. Jackson was desperate to protect his son's fragile reputation at all costs. He turned to me, his face twisted in rage, and refused to listen to a single word of my explanation. He didn't care about the system logs. In front of the entire engineering department, he publicly humiliated me. He yelled that my incompetence had put the company at risk. He stripped me of all my operational responsibilities and placed me on an indefinite suspension without pay for gross negligence. But both men committed a fatal corporate oversight. They were so blinded by their own arrogance and their rush to scapegoat me that they forgot who they were dealing with. Years ago, because of the company's past infrastructure vulnerabilities, I had implemented a highly specialized, decentralized offline security protocol. I called it a cold Stanby snapshot anchor. I knew that a major cyber attack or server fire could destroy our digital assets. So I designed a system where a complete, perfect, restorable backup of the entire $60 million transaction engine was isolated on an encrypted hardware drive. And that drive did not live on the company cloud. It didn't live on the corporate servers. It sat safely inside my personal purse, wrapped in a black velvet sleeve. Without me, the company's servers were nothing more than an empty, unrecoverable shell. There was no other copy in existence. I didn't argue, I didn't raise my voice. I didn't even try to defend myself against their absurd lies. I simply stood up from my chair with perfect posture, calmly packed my few personal belongings into a small cardboard box, and placed my car keys in my pocket. I surrendered my corporate laptop on the desk without a single word of protest. Lucas watched me leave with a smug, victorious grin on his face, believing he had successfully shifted the blame and won the battle. Jackson stood next to him, breathing heavily, thinking he had saved his son's career. I walked past them, stepped into the elevator, and rode it down to the lobby in total silence. I knew the absolute truth. I knew that without my unique, custom decryption key and the physical drive sitting in my bag, the company was completely helpless. The clock was officially ticking, and the total operational collapse of Aegis Financial Systems was already underway. They had just thrown away the only person who could save them. When I arrived at my house, the neighborhood was completely quiet. The peaceful silence was a sharp contrast to the screaming and flashing red lights I had just left behind at the office. I walked into my kitchen, hung up my coat, and poured myself a warm cup of coffee. I sat down at my kitchen table, took a deep breath, and opened a locked drawer where I kept my personal records. I pulled out a thick, faded manila folder. Inside was my original employment contract from 9 years ago. Back then, Aegis Financial Systems wasn't a giant corporate empire. It was just a struggling 3-person startup operating out of a tiny, cramped office, because they couldn't afford to pay me a high market salary at the time. I had fought hard for specific legal protections in my paperwork. I turned the pages until I found exactly what I was looking for. Section 4C. Section 4C was a very special intellectual property clause that I had personally written and insisted upon before signing. The clause stated very clearly that any custom framework, core logic, or underlying system architecture that I designed outside of standard business hours using my own personal computer equipment remained my exclusive personal intellectual property. The company did not own the code. Instead, Aegis was simply granted an operational license to use it. More importantly, that license was completely dependent on my active status as a fully compensated executive employee of the company. I leaned back in my chair and took a sip of my coffee. By placing me on an indefinite suspension without pay, based on false accusations, Jackson had materially breached my employment contract. The moment he stopped paying me, that software license vanished. Legally, the $60 million OmniCore transaction engine was no longer theirs to use. It belonged entirely to me. But I wasn't ready to call them just yet. First, I wanted to see how deep a hole they would dig for themselves. I opened my personal laptop and booted up a private, read-only network protocol. I had built this hidden backdoor connection years ago for emergency diagnostics, and the company's IT department didn't even know it existed. My screen lit up, showing me a real-time view of the company's empty servers. What I saw was painful to watch, but absolutely brilliant for my case. Lucas was in complete panic mode. He was frantically attempting to run amateur generic data recovery scripts on the primary databases. Anyone with basic tech knowledge knows that when you delete data, the files are still technically there until you write new data over them. But Lucas didn't know this. His frantic commands were actually overwriting the empty server blocks, permanently destroying any remaining fragments of the original code. He was effectively erasing the digital footprints of his own crime, but he was also making it completely impossible for any outside tech expert to recover the system. Outside my quiet kitchen, the corporate world was beginning to fracture. On my second monitor, I pulled up the live financial news tickers. Aegis's major corporate clients, including some of the largest investment firms in the country, were experiencing massive, catastrophic blackouts. They couldn't process payments. Their customer portals were down. Because of the panic, Aegis's corporate stock price began a brutal vertical nosedive, losing 15% of its value in just a few hours. I picked up my phone and dialed a number I knew by heart. It was Sarah Jenkins, one of the most ruthless corporate litigation attorneys in the city. When she answered, I told her everything that had happened, from the boardroom demotion to the deleted database. I told her I had the contract, the server logs, and the physical backup drive right next to me. Sarah let out a low whistle over the phone and told me to stay perfectly quiet. I smiled, knowing that I now held absolute undeniable leverage over the entire company's survival. Over the next 48 hours, my personal phone did not stop vibrating. It rang every 20 minutes, lighting up the kitchen counter with Jackson Sterling's name. I didn't answer a single call. I didn't reply to a single text message. I chose absolute, calculated, strategic silence. As the hours ticked away, I watched Jackson's messages completely transform. On Tuesday afternoon, his texts were aggressive and filled with furious corporate threats. He wrote that I was legally required to return to the office immediately to fix my mess, or he would sue me for everything I owned. By Wednesday morning, the tone shifted completely. The anger was gone, replaced by a desperate, sweating plea. One voicemail said, Emma, please call me back. We need your help. Let's sit down and talk about a massive bonus. Just tell us how to get the servers back online. I ignored them all. There is an old rule in business strategy. Never interrupt your enemy when they are in the middle of destroying themselves. Instead of talking to Jackson, I spent those 2 days sitting in a glass conference room at my attorney's office. Sarah Jenkins and I were quietly loading the weapon. We constructed an airtight, undeniable legal dossier. We compiled a perfect digital timeline of the entire disaster. I provided immutable server access logs that showed the exact digital footprint of Lucas's user profile executing the hard delete command. To make our case completely bulletproof, I pulled the high-definition security footage from the engineering floor. I had downloaded the local backup files right before I walked out of the building. The video footage was incredibly clear. It showed the exact timestamp of noon. It showed me sitting perfectly still, with my hands completely away from my keyboard, quietly holding a coffee mug. Meanwhile, the camera caught Lucas leaning over his desk, sweating, and frantically clicking his mouse right as the system monitors went dark. The evidence was absolute. It proved Lucas did it, and it proved they both knew it. While we built our legal trap in silence, the external corporate pressure on Aegis reached an absolute boiling point. The company's largest and most powerful enterprise client, an institutional banking giant named Meridian Trust, was losing millions of dollars every single hour because our transaction engine was dead. They couldn't move funds, and their clients were furious. On Wednesday afternoon, the news broke that Meridian Trust had issued a formal legals to Aegis Financial Systems. They were threatening a massive, immediate breach of contract lawsuit worth $15 million annually. For a company of our size, a lawsuit that large wouldn't just hurt. It would cause total irreversible bankruptcy. I knew Jackson was cornered. He had a choice to make. He could either tell the truth to his board of directors and admit that his spoiled son had ruined the company, or he could tell a massive lie to buy himself some time. Knowing Jackson's immense pride and his desperate need to protect his family's legacy, I knew exactly which path he would choose. He was going to lie publicly, and that lie was exactly what I needed to spring our trap. My strategy was to allow him to climb as high as possible onto his mountain of falsehoods before I pulled the ground out from under his feet. The trap was fully set, the timeline was locked, and all we had to do now was wait for him to take the bait. On Thursday morning, Jackson Sterling made the most dangerous choice a corporate executive can make. Instead of walking into the boardroom swallowing his immense pride and admitting that his spoiled son had accidentally wiped out our company's entire core asset, he chose to execute a massive public cover-up. I was sitting in my living room when the emergency notification flashed across my phone screen. Aegis Financial Systems had just called an emergency virtual meeting for all major shareholders and investors. Minutes later, the company released an official press statement to the media. I stared at the screen as I read the words. Jackson had written a bold, detailed statement claiming that Aegis had fallen victim to a highly sophisticated, coordinated, rogue external cyber attack. He told the public that international hackers had breached our security perimeter and temporarily disrupted our operations. He falsely assured our panic-stricken investors that his elite internal engineering team, now spearheaded by the brilliant Lucas Sterling, was working around the clock and was just hours away from a total system restoration. To make the lie stick and to protect his son's fragile career, Jackson decided he needed a scapegoat. A few hours after the press release, a courier arrived at my front door and handed me a crisp white envelope. It was a formal notice changing my suspension into an immediate termination for cause. Jackson hadn't just fired me. He had publicly painted me as the negligent engineer whose poor security practices allowed the fictional hackers to breach our network. At noon, things became even more surreal. I turned on a major financial news network, and there was Lucas. He was sitting under the bright studio lights, wearing a tailored navy suit, looking like a heroic young tech executive saving the day. The anchor asked him how his team was handling the breach, and Lucas smirked right at the camera. He said that the previous architecture was outdated and full of security holes, but under his new leadership, they were completely rebuilding the system to be stronger than ever. Watching the broadcast from my couch, I didn't get angry. In fact, I couldn't help but smile. By fabricating an external cyber attack to regulators, banking clients, and public shareholders, Jackson and Lucas had officially crossed the line from a messy internal corporate dispute into criminal securities fraud. They had lied to the public to keep the stock price from completely crashing. In their desperate rush to frame me and save themselves, they had handed me the ultimate legal weapon. I immediately called my attorney, Sarah Jenkins, and told her to watch the news. I could hear the excitement in her voice when she answered. She told me that they had just climbed to the very top of their mountain of lies, and now it was time to pull the ground out from under them. I instructed Sarah to bypass the executive suite entirely. We didn't send our response to Jackson or HR. Instead, Sarah delivered our comprehensive legal dossier directly to two specific people: the independent chairman of the Aegis Board of Directors and the chief legal counsel of our largest client, Meridian Trust. The dossier contained the raw, immutable server access logs, the high-definition security footage of Lucas clicking the delete key, and my original employment contract proving that the company no longer even had the legal right to use the codebase. I knew that the truth was about to land exactly where it would cause the maximum possible damage, and there was absolutely nothing Jackson could do to stop it. The reaction from the board of directors was immediate, explosive, and completely devastating for the Sterling family. When the independent chairman opened our legal dossiers and saw the undeniable digital footprints, the entire corporate facade collapsed. The server logs proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that the sophisticated cyber attack was a complete fabrication. There were no international hackers. There was only a spoiled, incompetent 23-year-old kid who didn't know how to read automated system warnings. At the same time, the chief legal counsel for Meridian Trust read the dossier. Realizing that the CEO of Aegis had lied directly to them about the nature of the blackout while their banking systems were losing millions, Meridian Trust immediately pulled their business. They formalized their $15 million breach of contract lawsuit and notified the board that they would be pursuing criminal investigations for fraud. The board realized they were staring into the abyss of total corporate annihilation. To make matters worse, their internal IT team finally admitted the bitter truth to the chairman. Lucas's frantic attempts to run data recovery scripts had permanently ruined the primary servers. The code was gone. The only surviving restorable copy of the $60 million transaction engine in the entire world was sitting on the encrypted hardware drive inside my purse. On Friday morning, my phone rang. It wasn't Jackson this time. It was the personal assistant to the chairman of the board, politely requesting my immediate presence at the corporate headquarters for an emergency session. When my car pulled into the corporate parking lot, I saw Jackson standing outside the front glass doors. He looked exhausted, his tie was loosened, and he was frantically speaking to a security guard. When he saw me step out of my vehicle, he tried to sprint toward me, shouting that I was trespassing, and that he would have me arrested if I didn't hand over my personal drive immediately. But before he could even get close, two corporate lawyers sent by the board stepped between us. They coldly informed Jackson that under emergency corporate bylaws, the board of directors had just voted to strip the CEO of his operational powers. They formally invited me back into the building as an independent, high-level crisis consultant. Walking back into the building where I had been publicly humiliated just days prior, I felt completely detached, calm, and in control. I wore an immaculate, sharp-tailored suit and held my head high. I carried the small, encrypted hardware drive openly in my left hand as I walked past the rows of glass cubicles. The entire tech floor had gone completely silent. My former engineering colleagues stared at me in absolute awe as I walked straight toward the executive elevators. When I pushed open the heavy mahogany doors of the executive conference room, the atmosphere inside was thick with dread. The room was filled with stone-faced board members and corporate lawyers. Lucas was sitting in the corner, sweating profusely through his expensive designer suit, looking down at his trembling hands. Jackson walked in behind me, looking physically ill, his face pale as he realized that their elaborate web of lies had completely unraveled. The independent chairman looked up from his papers, looked directly at me, and asked me to take a seat at the table. The trap had officially sprung, and it was time for me to dictate the terms of their surrender. I walked to the head of the conference table, taking my place opposite the independent chairman. The total shift in power was instantaneous. The board members, who had ignored my department for years, leaned forward in absolute silence. I connected my personal tablet to the boardroom's massive projection screen. With a single tap, the screen filled the room with the raw server access logs from Tuesday morning. I kept my voice entirely flat, professional, and deadly calm as I began to methodically guide the board members through the exact digital timeline of the catastrophe. I pointed directly to the glowing red text on the screen. I explained that at exactly 11:45 a.m., Lucas Sterling's unique administrative profile logged into the primary production database. I showed the automated system logs, proving that the network generated 3 separate, full-screen red warning prompts. These prompts explicitly stated that executing a hard delete command on this root directory would permanently wipe out the live transaction engine. I showed the board the exact metadata trailing Lucas's digital footprint. At exactly 12 p.m., Lucas ignored the final warning and clicked the execute button. I looked across the table at Lucas, whose face was completely pale. I told the board that there was no external cyber attack or international hacker. There was only the CEO's son, completely bypassing our safe testing environment because he wanted to clear out what he foolishly called a messy back-end file structure. Before Jackson could speak, my attorney, Sarah Jenkins, stood up and placed a stack of legal documents in front of every board member. Sarah explained that they needed to understand the legal reality. She directed them to Section 4C of my original employment contract from 9 years ago. In clear language, Sarah explained that because the underlying logic of OmniCore was developed outside of standard business hours on my personal equipment, Aegis Financial Systems never actually owned the proprietary engine. They only possessed an operational license that was strictly contingent on my active status as a fully compensated executive employee. Sarah looked at the chairman and told him that by changing my suspension into a termination for cause under false pretenses, Jackson had materially breached that contract. The moment he stopped paying me under a fraudulent claim, the company's software license was instantly revoked. Legally, the $60 million system now belonged exclusively to me. Jackson could not contain himself. He slammed both of his fists onto the table, his face turning a deep shade of purple. He screamed that this was a cheap setup, a pathetic act of extortion, and a blatant theft of assets. He yelled at the board to have me arrested immediately. But Sarah did not back down. She reached into her briefcase and slid a separate legal document across the table, stopping it right in front of Jackson's trembling hands. It was a copy of the federal compliance statutes regarding securities fraud and deliberate investor deception. Sarah told him completely calmly that if he did not sit down, we would immediately deliver our evidence to federal prosecutors. She explained that by lying to public shareholders and major clients about a fake cyber attack just to protect his son, Jackson had committed a serious corporate crime that carried a heavy prison sentence. Jackson froze, his mouth half open as the realization of his criminal exposure completely broke his spirit. The independent chairman turned his head away from Jackson with pure disgust. The other board members began whispering frantically, looking at the father and son as if they were a toxic disease. Suddenly, Lucas completely cracked under the intense pressure. He buried his face in his hands, weeping openly, his tears soaking into his expensive designer suit. He sobbed loudly, yelling that it was not his fault and that his father had forced him to take the engineering role because they needed a family member to control the core department. He screamed that he never wanted to touch the code and that Jackson had told him to lie to the media. I let the silence hang before delivering my single, non-negotiable ultimatum. I looked the chairman dead in the eye and stated my terms. Lucius Sterling must be terminated immediately with prejudice. Jackson Sterling must execute a forced, immediate resignation from his position as CEO and surrender his seat on the board. I was to be appointed as the new Chief Technology Officer immediately, backed by a controlling 15% equity stake in the restructured company. I picked up the small encrypted hardware drive, held it up, and told them that if they refused, I would walk out of the building. I would let Meridian Trust file their $15 million lawsuit, and by tomorrow morning, this entire company would be completely bankrupt. The final choice was now entirely theirs. The board did not even require a formal debate. The independent chairman looked around the long mahogany table, saw the terrified faces of the remaining directors, and called for an immediate voice vote. Within 10 minutes, they voted completely unanimously to accept every single one of my non-negotiable terms. Jackson and Lucas were completely stripped of their corporate titles, forced to sign absolute liability waivers right there at the table, and ordered to surrender all company property. 2 armed corporate security guards entered the room, grabbed both men by their shoulders, and escorted them out of the building. Their careers and reputations within the global financial tech community were permanently destroyed. They walked down the main hallway in utter humiliation, passing the very engineers they had insulted, leaving behind the massive tech empire they had tried to run, with nothing but pure arrogance and unearned privilege. Jackson looked completely broken, his head bowed, while Lucas continued to sob into his hands as the heavy glass doors closed behind them forever. Once the executive conference room was finally cleared of the chaos, I calmly sat down at the primary administrator terminal. I pulled the small encrypted hardware drive out of my velvet sleeve and plugged it into the main server port. I opened my personal secure interface and executed the deep decryption sequence, typing in the complex 90-character alphanumeric key that only I knew. Within less than 2 minutes, the dark monitors surrounding the room began to flash with lines of clean, running code. The operational metrics turned from pitch black back to a bright, vibrant green. Omnicore flashed back to life, immediately restoring critical financial services to Meridian Trust and completely stabilizing the company's collapsing market valuation. Down the hall, I could hear the entire engineering team erupt in loud, spontaneous cheers as their systems came back online. But I simply watched the green status bars clear with quiet satisfaction. The transaction engine was running perfectly, better than ever before, completely clean of any internal errors or corruption. The independent chairman walked over, shook my hand firmly, and thanked me for saving the company from absolute ruin. An hour later, I stood inside the spacious corner executive office on the top floor, the exact room that once belonged to the arrogant family that had tried to erase my entire life's work. I placed my cardboard box on the polished mahogany desk, took a slow sip of my warm tea, and looked out over the sprawling city skyline. The entire power dynamic of the company had shifted permanently under my feet. The entitled son who thought a corporate crown could simply be inherited learned the hardest lesson of his life. He learned that true power cannot be gifted by an indulgent father. It is built through years of quiet competence, documented with flawless precision, and executed with absolute, devastating strategy. As the new Chief Technology Officer and a major shareholder, I knew that Aegis was finally safe, because the foundational architecture was no longer built on nepotism, but on absolute, undeniable mastery. I sat down in my new leather chair, completely at peace, ready to lead the engineering department into a brand new era of real success. They tried to destroy my career to protect a lie, but their own arrogance gave me total control of the company. I watched the sun begin to set over the city, knowing that justice had been served and that my life's work was finally mine to protect. It was a clean, perfect, and absolute victory. I was finally back home.